We have reached the last show of 2025, and I want to talk about 2026. We're going to make some predictions, some things I'm excited about, some things that make me a little worried about next year, and what's going to be another really jam-packed, very cool, very challenging year in women's football. What a year it's been. What a year it's going to be. Thank you, everyone who listened for us this year. It's been a great year of women's football coverage, and I just want to talk about what's going to happen next. Let's jump in. So we have reached the end of 2025. This is our final show before the new year. And I don't want to look back on 2025. If you want to do that, you can go and listen to a whole year of shows. I want to talk about the future. Now, I'm not very good at predictions. I think you can go back to a whole year of the late sub and watch me make all these different ideas about who's going to win what. And I'm always like close, but never quite right. Not very good at predictions, not even that very good at New Year's resolutions. But I think it would be fun to do a couple of projections here for 2026 based on vibes, results, things that have changed in the off-season news, big teams that are in season, some results that we've seen. Maybe paint a picture of what we think 2026 or what I think 2026 could look like, because the soccer calendar refuses to slow down. And I think it's going to be another really interesting year. So we're just going to put this into a list here. 5 bold, semi-bold predictions for women's soccer in 2026. Now, the first one is, I think this is general, but not, and we'll get into the particulars, between the NWSL, WSL, and Champions League. I don't think there are going to be any repeat champions in 2026. I think we're hitting a really lovely era of parity worldwide in global women's soccer. I think that's really exciting. By the numbers, maybe saying something like that's a big statement. I think like WSL in particular, Chelsea came into this season as the 6-time reigning WSL champions, with a roster that's only getting stronger. They've been pretty aggressive in the transfer market as well. You look at NWSL, the Kansas City Current were the winningest NWSL team of all time. Look at Gotham in the championship. They've won 2 out of the last 3 NWSL championships. Maybe you can believe it for Champions League, and we'll talk about that too. But I think there's this push-pull of the best teams are getting better, but also so is the rest of these leagues and the rest of the world. And I think we're already seeing interesting stuff in the WSL that indicates that Chelsea, in particular's stronghold on the league, is beginning to show some cracks. I know bigger experts in English, women's football than me have talked extensively about some of the issues they have with the way Sonia Bonpastor utilizes that squad. They're obviously incredibly deep. They've, like I said, been aggressive in the transfer market, but they're also possibly a roster in more transition than it might appear, even if it is just sort of, there is this roster that was put together by Emma Hayes over a series of years. We're now moving into multiple years under Bonpastor. They're making acquisitions, but they're holding on to a lot of players as well. The squad might be in more transition than it appears. And it seems that Bonpastor has also appeared to inherit and maybe even exacerbate some of her predecessors' tactical rigidity that doesn't necessarily lean into the strengths of the roster or play particularly free-flowing, attacking football. It's a little bit pragmatic. And I think sometimes when people watch this Chelsea team, they don't necessarily think that they're always playing up to their standard because they come in a little bit too conservative tactically under Bonpastor. And you're starting to see the results shift a little bit too, right? Chelsea saw their, I think it was 34-game unbeaten streak in the WSL that was snapped last week by Everton. We're seeing Manchester City sitting atop the table going into the new year. They have a 6-point cushion over Chelsea. Arsenal also has reasons to be aggressive in the new year. I just think that this is the year for a different WSL champion, with Chelsea looking a little bit unconvincing at times and other squads having the ability to put up big numbers, as I just think that league in general grows in strength. I like Manchester City. It seems like they're finally getting serious. I mean, obviously, I love their squad. Benny Shaw is on another level. I just think that that is a team that's going to be able to continue to score a lot of goals as the season goes on. And I obviously also like that Manchester City appeared to get kind of serious when they made some moves to shore up their coaching staff. I'm just curious if there's like a real run to be made there for City, with, again, Chelsea looking a little bit more vulnerable than they have in the past. The season is long, and we also know Chelsea has come in under the wire during this 6 championship run as well. So maybe there's a big push to be made for the Blues at the end of the year, or end of the season. But I don't know. There's potential here, and that's exciting. I think a real title race in the WSL is a very, very exciting thing. Now, for NWSL, maybe a little less bold for the, this is the league of parity, to say that there's going to be different teams rising and falling every year. But there are also, again, those little signs, little things there in Kansas City and in New Jersey that make you think maybe other teams are going to have a shot. Maybe the Orlando Pride rises again. Maybe the Washington Spirit, after settling this huge offseason, maybe everything goes perfectly for them. They retain all their stars and they go on to have a perfect year. But you're already seeing, again, inside these clubs, maybe why 2026 might be a little bit more difficult to replicate the results of 2025. Coaching shakeup in Kansas City might ultimately not be bad for the program in the long run. I'm not saying that that's devastating for them by any means. As Vlatko Andonovski moves away from that dual head coaching sporting director role to just be the sporting director, might be good for their potential in the postseason. As we saw, there was sort of that really rough sort of belly flop against Gotham in the first round of this year's playoffs, where Andonovski kind of got caught, stuck in headlights. But it's still a lot of change for a team that seems to thrive on roster stability, coaching stability, and natural progression. I think a good example is that their defense this year versus in 2024 got significantly better without any huge swing signings. They actually were able to withstand some injuries to that back line. You saw a team, when given time to sort of cook together, turn into something more than the sum of their parts. I don't know if they're going to have that exact same. I just think when you go ahead and you make those changes, you have Andonovski move, that sort of thing, places a lot of pressure on the new coach coming in. We still don't know who that is. I think Kansas City is a playoff team for sure. And in fact, it's possible that if they do fall short of the Shield, that might be good for them to maybe kind of shake off some of the monkey on their back in terms of the postseason. They might be able to be the new championship winners. I just don't know if they're repeating as Shield winners. And like I said, I'm not sure that's necessarily in the long term bad for them if they want to go ahead and chase that championship trophy. Same vibes for Gotham. I mean, obviously they do have a lot of stability, I think, going from this season to next season. I think re-signing Midge Purse was great for their continuity. I think she's still incredibly important for them. We saw that in that championship game. She's just really, really good at knockout soccer. But they also had to have a lot of things go right for them during the 2025 postseason to make the run that they made. Obviously, Rose Lavelle was incredible for them in the postseason, but she is often injured. I think it's a lot to ask her to carry heavy minutes in 2026. Their roster is getting a little bit older, as we've seen. Like, their all-stars of this postseason run are some of like the true vets of the league, which I love watching all of that, talent, experience, and sort of that wonderful window come together for them. That window will eventually close and they themselves are going to have to revamp. I don't know if this is the year that needs to happen, but for example, they have the Women's Champions Cup in England in January. They are still in this cycle of the CONCACAF Champions Cup. They have to play the Challenge Cup as the reigning champions. They're going to have a lot of matches played by the midsummer break. And I don't know if this group, which is meant for these short runs, honing, just really focused football, is set up to stay at that level. Now, maybe they do what they did this year and they let it dip midseason. They regroup. They make that run to the playoffs. They make the run to the championship. Maybe they run the playbook back and it works perfectly. I think it's a tall task. And I think that is living dangerously as a plan. And so I'm really curious. I think actually there were some complaints or maybe criticism of Gotham this postseason because it seemed like they worked in the dip. They were like, we're going to have this period of the year where we know things aren't going to be amazing, but we're going to be good at the start. We're going to be good at the finish. I think it's living dangerously. I think it's an interesting way to play an NWSL season. I'm curious to see if they do it again, or maybe they front load again and they're like, we want to win Champions Cup. We want to win CONCACAF Champions Cup. And whatever happens after that. And then Champions League, maybe my extended take. I mean, Arsenal has had a slow start from what I'm hearing, reporting out in England. Again, experts far more in depth for a team like Arsenal than I. They have moved kind of immediately from this wonderful Champions League win, which was incredible, to feeling like maybe they need to rejuvenate the squad as well. They need to get a little bit younger. I don't think there's a ton of surprise that maybe they're having some trouble in Champions League to start. They've done well. They've rebounded, but they had a slow start in Champions League. They're in third currently in WSL. I think maybe my true hot take, rather than saying like Arsenal is not going to repeat as Champions League, because I think that's at this point people are kind of like coming around to that idea, is I have really good feelings about Lyon this year. I wonder actually if we'll see another Champions League final with no English side involved. I like Lyon's management. I think, Heraldez is incredibly talented. I think that he's got a good eye for winning things like Champions League. Obviously, I think their midfield is wicked and deeper than it's been in the past. I think that they have a lot of options coming off the bench for them. Their attack is bonkers. De Mornay is ridiculous. We saw this last week in Champions League. I imagine we will see it again this week in Champions League phase. I kind of like them to make the final this year. And Barca is still Barca. They're still the standard. I anticipate Barcelona being in the Champions League final as well. But I think maybe my true hot take for Champions League is after, a year in the wilderness a little bit, I like Lyon a lot. I think that they have come back better than ever. So that was a long point on the third point, maybe many points within my first projection, but these next ones are going to be a little bit shorter. Some quick hits here. Moving to the NWSL season, I think Sophia Wilson is going to contend for NWSL MVP next year. This is a couple predictions mixed into one, maybe implied. I don't think Wilson is leaving the NWSL. I'll be curious to see if she's actually seriously considering leaving Portland. I imagine we'll get some news on that soon. Knowing, my luck, it'll break the moment we finish recording this. But I think she's going to be in NWSL this season, and I think she's going to be ready to hit the ground running once preseason begins. I think 2026 is going to be the year of the comeback in general, with Wilson leading the way. She does make me think that she's poised. We all saw Alex Morgan's incredible season with San Diego in 2022, where she came back from pregnancy, scored 15 goals, made the Wave look like geniuses for a couple of years. I really think we could see that similar trajectory for Wilson. I think she's going to make an impact at the U.S. Women's National Team level. We talked about that a couple weeks ago. I think that the U.S. has a great kind of conundrum on their hands figuring out how to get a player like Wilson back in the mix. I even wonder if a year away doesn't hone some of those tendencies in front of goal. I think coming back from pregnancy is actually a really interesting opportunity in the grand scheme of sports. It's a clean slate in a lot of ways to maybe work on some technical things as you come back and work your way back into fitness. I think that Wilson's only ever problem is that she could score twice the goals that she actually scores because she puts herself in such good positions. Curious what that looks like coming back after a year away from the game. I don't know if we're ever going to get triple espresso, that trio, back in the same exact way ever again. But Wilson feels like the sure bet to me to make a serious push with an eye towards that 2027 World Cup roster. And in the context of the NWSL, I don't think she's going to be alone. Like I said, we're manifesting the year of the comeback. Barbara Banda, hopefully back better than ever. Would love for Temwa Chawinga to specifically get a chance to show what she can do in the playoffs. I want to see Tierna Davidson making the U.S. think twice about their defender decisions. I want Trinity Rodman back in the NWSL. I want her feeling healthy. I want Mal Swanson back in the NWSL. I want her feeling healthy. Hopefully that's all in the cards. That's a lot of moving parts, but I do hope that maybe we see this resurgence after a year where it felt like there were a lot of stars away from the game, and also even the NWSL's biggest stars that were playing had their seasons or postseasons cut short by injury. It's going to take a lot to unseat Chawinga as a two-time reigning NWSL MVP, but I think she's going to have competition, and I'm excited for that, and I think Wilson is going to be in the mix. Which leads me to my third prediction, which is that I think the U.S. Women's National Team is going to leave a big veteran name off of the World Cup qualifying roster once we get to November 2026. This is maybe, again, these things, like, they feel crazy to say out loud, but also you can see the work kind of being put into where we get there, right? You're starting to feel the winds of change with the U.S. After a year of roster experimentation. The team's getting younger in a substantive way that doesn't feel like they're just waiting for some veterans to enter back into the mix. I think a good thing that Emma Hayes has been doing is when she does have these young, inexperienced rosters, it's not falling into that trap that we've seen in past years where you're like, oh, okay, that team's going to play these games, but then the real players are going to come back. I don't think that's the vibe for the U.S. this year. I think it's more of, if this was the team that we needed tomorrow, are they ready? And I think that's a lot healthier of a mindset rather than being like, oh, we'll slot this player in, we'll slot that player in. Yes, of course, they're going to be eager for returns. Like I said, I think Wilson is going to have a lot to say on the international stage in 2026. But I don't think we're just waiting for, for quote unquote, the grownups to return. And I think that is really exciting as well. I'm not talking about injuries. They're a part of the sport. I think, the sad truth is that there's probably going to be some major talent that's going to be struggling with availability in 2026 and in 2027 and 2028 because injuries are a part of soccer. But I'm talking about making those roster changes to allow the young rising players to basically just step into their roles and not worry too much about too much veteran leadership. Or if we do see that, you're going to see those locker room pieces. And I'd like to think that we're going to be seeing these young players get starts. And we've seen Hayes do this before. The big famous story, as we know, is coming in and leaving Alex Morgan off of the 2024 Olympic roster, despite Morgan being healthy and available for selection. Hayes isn't afraid to make the bold moves. And I also just keep coming back to that last U.S. Women's National Team loss against Portugal in November. that was a lineup that featured a lot of international experience in its midfield specifically. That game went really poorly. That felt to me like maybe that wrap up moment of like, okay, maybe it's really time to move on. And not for nothing, the timing is right. This is going to be a weird, actually, international schedule in 2026 because of the Men's World Cup. We'll actually talk about that in a second. But I think they're going to have some time in January, February, in the spring to build that chemistry, to start focusing in on what the team wants to become going into World Cup qualifying in November. But this isn't a decision that has to be made by the summer, which I find really, really interesting. They're not on a short runway here still, even after a full year of experimentation. I wonder if that empowers Hayes to make the tough roster decisions sooner rather than later, have those conversations with veterans before World Cup qualifying, rather than feeling like you're having those conversations before the World Cup itself and allowing a young team to catch up. I don't think that there's anything that she's done this year that makes it seem like she's afraid to make those decisions. I think we've also seen this young group respond really well to not feeling like they had a safety net. I just like the way the young players play. And I think maybe that is one of the main takeaways, if we are looking back briefly in 2025, is that I think that the U.S. had moments this year where they looked better than they've looked since 2019. And they also had moments where they looked like they were reverting back to those kinds of, again, those years where they really struggled with top competition, 2023, 2022, 2021, right? Who was on the pitch for that? And I think that Hayes is going to start seeing those decisions being made, because I think that that dichotomy is hopefully as helpful as the good things and the bad things. My sub hot take for World Cup qualifying, and we'll talk about this more once we get closer to it, I'm really curious to see if there's actually a chance for a new number 2 in the region. Canada has really been struggling. And I don't know what they're going to be able to do with their roster from, January 2026 all the way to November to make them feel more unified under Casey Stoney and make it feel like the results are coming. The CONCACAF is in a really interesting place right now, and we'll probably do a deeper dive once we get closer to that. But that's a sub hot take. I wonder if there is a place for a new number 2, or if Canada can figure it out. Moving back to NWSL, number 4. This one is, a little bit balanced on each side, but I think that it's real. More stars are going to leave the NWSL in 2026. But on the same time, I think we're going to see some stars rise and come into the NWSL in 2026. But you're like, oh, bold prediction, there's going to be transfers. And it's like, yeah, I do think that's a bold prediction. They're going to be transfers on both sides. But more so, I don't think this story is going away for the NWSL, regardless of what Trinity Rodman decides to do. Again, knowing me, she's going to announce her decision the moment we're done. But whether she stays or whether she goes, I think that this story is going to continue. But I think the best case scenario for the NWSL is it starts to focus into very specific instances of talent loss rather than it feeling overwhelming. I am not, frankly, particularly bullish on the NWSL's proposed new mechanism, which everyone, read about at the end of last week, to pay high impact players additional cap exempt money. This is, again, the creative accounting that we were expecting as we talk about the Trinity Rodman saga, because the NWSL is not going to give up the salary cap. They'd rather have these new kind of mechanisms to allow certain players to get paid more under the cap, all this sort of stuff. It's not my favorite. I think I made that pretty clear last week. We don't have all the details. ESPN threw out a lot of possible rules surrounding the measure without nailing down what the new mechanism will actually entail in terms of what constitute a high impact player. It still feels like allocation money part 2 to me. I did not think allocation money was a success. However, I do think in the short term it'll be helpful, just like allocation money was for a time. It also won't stop big name players from leaving the league when they have other things that they want to do without that actual fundamental change to the cap system. I think we're probably going to be having this conversation again in 5 years about what can be done to retain stars in the growing global market. And as of this recording, that measure, even that creative accounting still hasn't been okayed by the Players Association. WSL transfer windows opens on January 2nd, and I think that's when things get really interesting. But I think the NWSL might be moving towards, I'm never too worried, because I think kind of things continued. We've seen a lot of really talented players come into the NWSL in the last couple of years, in addition to the players who have left, where they've maybe got one untenable problem in the NWSL. U.S. women's national team players who are established stars want more freedom under the cap. They want new experiences. And the U.S. women's national team structure in 2025, 2026, and beyond allows them way more control over their own careers, with a friendliness towards going over to Europe and chasing that dream. that is a specific problem, as opposed to being like the NWSL doesn't have talented players, right? I think that they have not solved that problem specifically with this measure. But I also don't think the NWSL is doomed to never attract talent ever again. And I think with this mechanism, if there's a star deal, a sweet star deal out there for teams to make, good or bad, I don't know what this mechanism is going to do to these locker rooms, but more star signings are in the future too. And it's either going to be, again, established, or it's going to be a player like Temwa Chawinga, like Barbara Banda, who is going to have the opportunity to create that stardom once they're in the States. My sub hot take, actually, this is just a little note that I'm excited for next year for the NWSL. Really excited for 16 teams, specifically 8 playoff spots for 16 teams. Make the playoffs hard again. That's my take. I think it's possible, actually, that an expansion team could make the NWSL playoffs next year. I think Denver's been pretty pragmatic with their signings. It seems like they have a lot of off-field momentum. Fascinated to see what they end up doing. But that's a little thing that I guess is not so much a take, but I'm just very excited. 8 playoff spots for 16 teams. I think there's just a lot of opportunity in the NWSL right now with expansion, with, again, the idea of new money mechanisms. I think that there is a lot there for players who are not currently in the league to be excited about. And I don't think that the NWSL is never going to sign a big player ever again. And then my last prediction thought for 2026, it's a big picture one, which is maybe a good one to end on, which is that next year is going to be kind of crazy. Not because of anything in women's soccer, but I'm here in the United States. The Men's World Cup, hosted in the US, Canada, and Mexico, is going to just wreak havoc on women's soccer in this part of the world for a year. We're excited about the World Cup, right? Like, I think it's all very exciting. I think there's a huge opportunity felt in the States to convert people into soccer fans. And I think that the discovery of soccer as a sport for your average American sports fan is a really exciting proposal here. I don't think there's anything bad about having that level of attention on the sport, but there are going to be logistical frustrations as to what the World Cup is going to mean. And I think that there is now a challenge for women's soccer to not let the 2026 World Cup dictate things negatively, but hopefully let it bolster things positively. Obviously, as we know, it's already significantly impacting the women's soccer calendar in pretty important ways. The NWSL is taking that whole section of the summer off after doing a whole section of the summer off in 2025. There's a huge gap in the women's international windows again. I think it's like from June to October. If things felt very stop and start in 2025, double that next year, except instead of it being a break for people to watch more women's soccer, major international women's soccer tournaments, the focus is going to be on the Men's World Cup. It's going to be a tricky year for NWSL clubs, both in terms of momentum and, again, facility logistics, training. It's going to place a lot of pressure on the U.S. women's national team to get a lot out of limited time together at the beginning of the year. And then, again, kind of this rush at the fall. It turns the fall into like a head rush of activity, which leads to a really significant scheduling bottleneck at the end of November. We laugh every year about how the NWSL title game, those players that like win a championship have to go right into U.S. women's national team camp after the big celebration. This year, it's going to be very serious. The NWSL championship is on November 21st. World Cup qualifying begins on the 24th. I'm certainly not imagining an old U.S. women's national team, of past years that yanked players out of their club environments before international windows began. But players are going to have complicated interests next year. The end of the calendar year is going to be very important, very high value, and just very, very busy. And so again, talk about a player on Gotham, for example. They are playing in one of like the biggest new club competitions in women's soccer history in January. And in November, they're trying to qualify for a World Cup. It is going to be a huge year. It is going to be a tricky year. And the NWSL, it's really, really important for them to capitalize on the hype around soccer in general and turn some of this wackiness into a positive, as opposed to something that feels like it's drowning out what's going to be a really cool year in women's football. The Late Sub is part of the Just Women's Sports Network. This show is written by Claire Watkins and produced and edited by Parker Fenton. To get more of your favorite women's sports content, subscribe to the Just Women's Sports newsletter and follow Just Women's Sports across all your favorite channels.